20,000 feet over Leipzig, Germany, the morning of the 20th of February, 1944, the second day of a week the 8th Air Force would come to call Big Week. A Boeing B-17G named 10 horsepower, serial number 42-31763, squadron code TU:A of the 510th Bombardment Squadron, 351st Bombardment Group, is running its bomb run when a squadron of German fighters comes in from the front, guns and cannon firing. In the space of a few seconds inside the cockpit, a cannon shell kills the co-pilot, Flight Officer Ronald Bartley, outright, and wounds the aircraft commander, First Lieutenant Clarence R. Nelson, so severely that he is knocked unconscious at the controls. The radio operator, Sergeant Joseph Rex, is also hit. The aircraft, its two trained pilots dead and unconscious, begins to fall out of formation toward the ground. Pause on that sentence. A 4-engine heavy bomber carrying a 10-man crew and several tons of bombs has just lost both of the only 2 men aboard who had ever been taught to fly it. What happens next did not happen because a Hollywood screenwriter needed a third act. It happened because a navigator who had never touched a set of flight controls in his life, and a flight engineer who had logged perhaps a few hours at the yoke during ferry flights, between them decided that the aircraft, and the unconscious man still breathing in the pilot's seat, were not going to be abandoned over Germany if there was any way at all to bring them home. This is not a story about one especially dramatic mission over Leipzig. This is a story about what chain of command actually meant, in practice, at 20,000 feet, when the men the chain of command had trained for exactly this moment were no longer able to answer it. Part 1. To understand how unusual what happened next really was, it helps to understand how rigidly a B-17 crew's roles were divided by rank and training in the first place. A standard Flying Fortress crew carried 4 commissioned officers, the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier, and 6 enlisted men, the flight engineer, who doubled as top turret gunner, the radio operator, the ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and the tail gunner. Only the pilot and co-pilot received actual flight training on multi-engine aircraft. The navigator's entire specialty was reading instruments, maps, and the stars to keep the formation on course, not flying the airplane itself, and the flight engineer's specialty was keeping the machine's 4 engines, hydraulics, and electrical systems working, not piloting it either. The system worked exactly as designed on the vast majority of missions flown by the 8th Air Force. Because on the vast majority of missions, the pilot and co-pilot came home, able to fly the aircraft themselves. 10 horsepower's crew that February morning included, besides Nelson, Bartley, and Rex, navigator 2nd Lieutenant Walter E. Truemper, bombardier 2nd Lieutenant Joseph Martin, flight engineer Staff Sergeant Archibald Mathies, and gunners Sergeants Carl Moore, Russell Robinson, Thomas Sowell, and Magnus Hagbo. 10 young men whose specific jobs had been assigned on the assumption that 2 of the 10, and only 2, would ever need to know how to fly the airplane they were all riding in. The pipeline that produced these 10 very differently trained young men reflected a rigid and mostly sensible division of labor. A man selected for pilot training went through primary, basic, and advanced flying school, accumulating well over 200 hours in the air before he was ever allowed near a 4-engine bomber, and only after that did he move on to transition training in the B-17 itself, followed by months more of combat crew training as a unit before deployment. A washout from that pipeline, a man who failed the increasingly demanding stages of flight school, did not simply leave the Army Air Forces. A great many of them were redirected into navigator school, bombardier school, or the enlisted specialist courses that produced flight engineers, radio operators, and gunners. Men who had wanted to fly and had, in a very real sense, come as close to it as the system allowed without actually putting them at a set of controls. Ronald Bartley himself, killed in the opening seconds of the attack that February morning, held the rank of flight officer rather than a full lieutenant's commission, the same ambiguous half-officer rank the Army had invented around the same period to cover glider pilots and certain other aircrew whose flying skill outpaced the traditional commissioning pipeline's ability to process them. Part 2. The mission itself was part of Operation Argument, a 5-day campaign the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched together beginning the 20th of February 1944 against Germany's aircraft manufacturing industry, hitting factories that built the fighters the Luftwaffe needed to keep contesting the skies over the Reich at all. Leipzig, the target that first day, hosted the Erla Maschinenwerk plant, one of the larger producers of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters in Germany, the very type of aircraft 10 horsepower's crew found waiting for them on the approach. The stakes of the week were understood at every level of command. Big Week was meant to grind down German fighter production and the trained pilots flying against the American bomber streams before the invasion of France, still months away, could be attempted at all. It was into exactly this defended airspace, over exactly this target, that 10 horsepower flew formation when the German fighters came through the American bomber stream head-on. Big Week, as the campaign came to be known almost as soon as it ended, threw more than 3,000 bomber sorties against German aircraft factories across 5 consecutive days, the first sustained test of a new escort strategy built around the long-ranged P-51 Mustang, which could now accompany the bomber formations deep into Germany and back, rather than turning for home at the German border the way earlier escort fighters had been forced to. The cost was heavy on both sides. American heavy bomber losses across the week ran into the hundreds of aircraft, and Luftwaffe fighter losses climbed high enough that some post-war historians would treat Big Week as the true opening blow of the air campaign that by June allowed Allied aircraft to operate over the Normandy beaches with only limited interference. None of the young men aboard 10 horsepower that morning could have known any of that as they climbed toward Leipzig. They knew only that the Erla Maschinenwerk plant below them built the fighters that had already begun climbing to intercept them. Part 3. What the surviving crew reported afterward, and what both men's eventual Medal of Honor citations describe in near-identical language, was that a squadron of enemy fighters attacked, with the result that the co-pilot was killed outright, the pilot wounded and rendered unconscious, the radio operator wounded, and the plane severely damaged. Whoever was near the front of the aircraft in those first seconds would have seen an unconscious, bleeding pilot slumped forward or sideways against the controls of a heavy bomber already beginning to drop out of formation. Precisely the moment every training manual assumed could never occur to both pilots simultaneously. At the altitude a B-17 bomb run over Leipzig was flown, typically above 20,000 feet, outside air temperatures routinely fell to 40 or 50 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, and a crewman whose oxygen system was damaged or disconnected could lose useful consciousness within a minute or two. Whatever passed through the cockpit in the seconds after the cannon shell hit, whoever reached it first found an aircraft already rolling or diving out of formation, an unconscious, bleeding pilot either slumped against the yoke or fallen away from it entirely, and a co-pilot beside him who was already dead, all of it happening at a speed and in a cold that gave no one aboard time to deliberate. Navigator Walter Truemper reached the cockpit and, according to the account both men's citations preserve, together with flight engineer Archibald Mathies, managed to right the plane, pulling it back into level, controlled flight, and turn it toward England, a distance of several hundred miles across German-occupied territory and the North Sea, flown by 2 men, neither of whom had ever been trained to land a B-17, and one of whom had never been trained to fly one at all. Ground crew and off-duty airmen at Polbrook, who had gathered to watch the damaged aircraft attempt its landing, became, without asking for the role, witnesses to the final minutes of 2 men's lives, watching a heavy bomber circle the field twice, pull up and go around twice, and come apart on the 3rd attempt in full view of the base that had trained neither Truemper nor Mathies to do what they were attempting. There was no dramatic radio silence, broken by a heroic final transmission of the kind later films would invent for scenes like this one. The surviving record simply shows 2 men who had already been given permission to save themselves, twice, choosing instead to try again. This was not the only time an 8th Air Force bomber crew had been forced to improvise past its own rank structure that year. 10 months earlier, on the 1st of May 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard "Snuffy" Smith had earned the Medal of Honor aboard a different B-17 by fighting fires, treating wounded crewmen, and manning a machine gun after his own aircraft was badly shot up over France. An act of individual courage the Army was glad to publicize precisely because Smith's own pilot, wounded but conscious, still brought the aircraft home himself. 10 horsepower's case was different in exactly the detail that made it harder to turn into a clean recruiting story. There was no wounded pilot at the controls giving orders from a hospital bed's worth of injuries. There was no pilot at the controls at all. Part 4. They reached the English coast and their home station at RAF Polebrook in Northamptonshire, contacted the control tower, and reported exactly what had happened. The rest of the crew, Bombardier Martin and the gunners, none of them needed at the controls, and none of them able to help land the aircraft, were ordered to parachute to safety over friendly territory. And they did, coming down safely across the English countryside. Truemper and Mathies stayed aboard. Above them, Major Elzia Ledoux, commanding officer of the group's 509th Bombardment Squadron, flew a second B-17, nicknamed My Princess, alongside the crippled aircraft to observe its condition and try to help talk the two men down. What he saw from the air was bad enough that he judged the aircraft could not be safely landed by two men with this little experience, and ordered them, in turn, to abandon the aircraft and parachute out themselves, the same order that had already saved everyone else aboard that day. That same blurred line between officer and enlisted status runs through more of this war's aviation history than most people realize. The flight officer rank that had marked Ronald Bartley, killed instantly in 10 horsepower's cockpit, was the same rank the Army had invented to solve the problem of glider pilots flying unarmed aircraft into occupied Europe without a clear place in the traditional commissioning ladder. Men this channel has already told the story of once. Bartley held that ambiguous rank as a fully qualified, fully trained co-pilot. The men who ultimately kept his aircraft in the air after he died held no aviation rank appropriate to the task at all. One an officer trained for an entirely different specialty, the other an enlisted man trained for a third. Between the two of them stood exactly the amount of formal flight training the United States Army Air Forces had ever intended to be enough. None. Part 5. It is worth pausing here on exactly what the popular shorthand version of this story gets right and where it overstates the case. Because the honest version is, if anything, more remarkable than the simplified one. 10 horsepower did not lose every officer aboard. Its bombardier, Lieutenant Martin, survived unharmed and bailed out safely, along with the enlisted gunners. Its navigator, Lieutenant Truemper, was very much alive and remained aboard by choice. What the aircraft actually lost, in the opening seconds of that fighter attack, was both of its trained pilots, the only two men rated to fly a multi-engine bomber at all. One killed instantly, and the other alive but unconscious and unable to be moved. The men who flew 10 horsepower home and tried 3 times to land it were, specifically, an officer with navigator's training and no flight instruction whatsoever, and an enlisted engineer with only a handful of hours at the controls from routine transit flights. Whether German fighter pilots that day specifically registered, in the moment, that the bomber limping back toward England was no longer being flown by anyone who had ever been taught to fly it, is not something any surviving German account confirms. No interview or after-action report from the Luftwaffe pilots engaged that morning describing this specific realization has survived in the historical record this channel could locate, and this video does not claim otherwise. What is verified beyond dispute is that Truemper and Mathies did exactly what the training system had never prepared either of them to do, and that they did it not for their own survival, which a parachute could have guaranteed at any point, but to keep an unconscious officer who could not save himself from being left to die alone in a falling airplane. No cockpit voice recorder captured what was said between Truemper and Mathies in the minutes after they reached the controls, and no surviving written account from either man exists, since both died within hours of the events in question. Everything historians know about those minutes comes secondhand, from the surviving crew members who bailed out over England, and from Major Ledoux's own observations flying alongside. What can be reconstructed with confidence is the sequence and the outcome. An aircraft that should, by every reasonable expectation built into its crew's training, have been abandoned or lost outright the moment both trained pilots went down, instead flew several hundred miles home across hostile and then friendly territory, in weather and cold that gave its improvised 2-man flight crew no margin for error, and came within 2 failed approaches of landing safely with a critically wounded man still aboard. Part 6. When Truemper and Mathies refused Major Ledoux's order to abandon the aircraft, telling him over the radio that the pilot was still alive but could not be moved and that they would not desert him, Ledoux relented and told them to attempt a landing instead. The first approach failed. The second failed as well. On the third attempt, 10 horsepower crashed into an open field near RAF Polebrook. Walter Truemper and Archibald Mathies were killed in the crash. Clarence Nelson, the pilot they had refused to abandon, survived the impact itself, according to some accounts, but died of his wounds shortly afterward. Other sources, describing the same crash, record all three men as having died together on impact, a discrepancy this channel has not been able to fully resolve between competing published accounts, and one it would rather disclose than paper over with false certainty. What is not in dispute is that three men who did not have to be aboard that aircraft when it finally came down were aboard it, and that two of them had every legal and practical justification to have left it hours earlier. Big Week itself is generally judged by historians to have succeeded in its narrower industrial goal, temporarily disrupting German fighter production, even as German factories dispersed and rebuilt output within months. Its larger and more lasting achievement was proving that American long-range escort fighters could now contest German airspace all the way to the target and back, a capability that would matter enormously 3.5 months later over the invasion beaches of Normandy. 10 Horsepower's crew flew into that same contested airspace on the campaign's opening day, before anyone flying that morning could have known how the week or the war would eventually be judged. Part 7. The honest shape of this story is not a clean tale of an ordinary sergeant single-handedly flying a bomber home while officers stood by, nor is it the story of every commissioned officer aboard being wiped out by enemy fire. It is something more specific, and, in its way, more interesting. A moment when the rank structure built to manage exactly this kind of emergency broke down along different lines than anyone had planned for. When the two men still capable of acting were an officer whose specialty had nothing to do with flying, and an enlisted man whose specialty was keeping engines running. And when both of them chose to stay with a wounded man, neither of them was under any specific written order to protect, rather than save themselves the moment saving themselves became possible. The commanding officer who ordered them to jump was not being callous. From where he sat, in the cockpit of My Princess, watching the damage on 10 Horsepower's airframe, letting two inexperienced men attempt a landing looked like trading 2 probable survivors for 3 probable deaths. He was, in the end, proven right about the outcome, and overruled anyway, because Truemper and Mathies were not weighing probabilities. They were refusing to leave a man behind. There is also a quieter irony, worth naming plainly rather than glossing over. The entire chain of command structure aboard a bomber like 10 Horsepower existed to guarantee that no single point of failure could bring the aircraft down, that a wounded pilot would always have a co-pilot, and that the mission would always have someone rated to fly the airplane home. What actually saved the aircraft's 10-man crew that morning, all but 3 of whom lived to see the following week, was not that redundancy working as designed. It was 2 men whose job descriptions had nothing to do with flying deciding, on their own initiative and against a direct order to abandon ship, that the redundancy the Army had built into its crew rosters was not going to be the reason a wounded, unconscious officer died alone. Both men were recommended for the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest award for valor, and both received it posthumously, by General Order No. 52, dated the 22nd of June, 1944, 4 months after the crash that killed them. Archibald Mathies had been born Archibald Collins Hamilton in Stonehouse, Scotland, in June 1918, emigrating with his mother to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania as a boy, and taking his stepfather's surname. He had worked in a coal mine before enlisting in the peacetime Army in December 1940, training as an airplane mechanic and later as an aerial gunner, and had flown this, his second combat mission, at the age of 25. Walter Edward Truemper, born in Aurora, Illinois in October 1918, the 8th of 10 children of German immigrant parents, had attended Northwestern University before enlisting, trained as a navigator at Ellington and Harlingen and Hondo Army airfields in Texas, and was 25 years old as well when he died. Truemper's Medal of Honor was presented to his mother at the family home in Aurora on the 4th of July, 1944, by Brigadier General R.E. O'Neill. Both men are buried in the United States, Mathies at Finleyville Cemetery in Pennsylvania, Truemper at St. Paul's Lutheran Cemetery in Illinois. A statue of Truemper stands today in his hometown of Aurora, and streets on American air bases from Lackland in Texas to Elmendorf in Alaska to Yokota in Japan carry his name, alongside training buildings named for Mathies at bases on both sides of the Atlantic. Archibald Mathies had not planned on becoming a flight engineer at all when he first enlisted in the peacetime army back in December 1940. The son of a Scottish coal mining family who had emigrated to Pittsburgh as a boy, he trained first as an airplane mechanic at Chanute Field, Illinois, cycled through several stateside squadrons over more than 2 years, and did not reach England until December 1943, joining the 510th Bomb Squadron only a month before the mission that killed him, on what was, by the time of his death, only his second combat mission of the war. Walter Truemper had an even less obviously martial path to that cockpit. An accounting clerk from Aurora, Illinois before the war, the 8th of 10 children of German immigrant parents, he had attended Northwestern University, enlisted in June 1942, and trained specifically as a navigator, a specialty built entirely around maps, compasses, and dead reckoning, with no portion of the curriculum devoted to the mechanics of actually flying an airplane. Clarence Nelson, the pilot the two men refused to abandon, did not survive to see any of it, dying either in the crash itself or of his wounds shortly afterward, depending on which account is believed. Joseph Martin, the bombardier who parachuted to safety along with the gunners that day, lived through the war. The fates of most of the enlisted gunners who came down safely over the English countryside that afternoon are not as fully documented in the widely available record, a gap this channel would rather note openly than fill with invented detail. Major Elzia Ledoux, who watched the whole final act unfold from the cockpit of My Princess and gave the order that Truemper and Mathies chose not to obey, continued to command the 509th Bombardment Squadron through the rest of the war. Archibald Mathies' Medal of Honor is on permanent display today at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a small case of ribbon and bronze standing in for a 25-year-old Scottish immigrant coal miner's son who had been in England barely 2 months and in combat for only his second mission when he died refusing to leave an unconscious officer behind. Truemper's medal went instead to his mother, presented at the family home in Aurora on Independence Day 1944 by a brigadier general standing in a Midwestern living room to hand a dead son's country's highest honor to the woman who had raised him. Only a small number of enlisted men in the entire 8th Air Force received the Medal of Honor during the war, and Mathies was one of them, a fact the Army itself treated as significant enough to attach his name afterward to training schools and barracks on both sides of the Atlantic, at RAF Feltwell and RAF Upwood in England, and at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, alongside a lodging building at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. Truemper's name would eventually mark streets on air bases as far apart as Texas, Alaska, and Japan, and a statue in his hometown of Aurora, Illinois, unveiled decades after his death, to a generation of townspeople who had grown up walking past a street sign bearing his name, without necessarily knowing why. None of the 10 men who took off from RAF Polbrook that February morning had any reason to expect their names would end up on street signs, training schools, or a glass case in a New Orleans museum 80 years later. They expected, at most, to survive a bomb run over Leipzig and fly home to a hot meal and a briefing. What the Army's own citations, written in the flat, bureaucratic language of general orders, ultimately preserved was something closer to the plain fact of 2 men's choice, made in a damaged airplane over a country that was actively trying to kill them, to keep trying, rather than to save themselves the moment saving themselves stopped requiring any courage at all. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More moments when the carefully built chain of command met a situation nobody had specifically trained for, and more ordinary men, officers and enlisted alike, who answered it not with the job they had been assigned, but with the job that was actually, suddenly, in front of them. 10 horsepower never really had a pilot flying at home. It had 2 men who refused to leave one behind.